Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Studio Salon Conversations in the Commons Surveillance. My name is Dan Huff, and I'm Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Studio Museum in Harlem. On behalf of the museum and the Public Programs team of Melania Graham, Naomi Aminu-Fessa, and Tennille Mack, we'd like to thank you so much for tuning in as the world continues to open up, and on a weekend nonetheless, which have become more and more precious. A little housekeeping. This program is being recorded. If you'd like to disable your video, please click Stop Video in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. Closed captioning, generously provided by Stenocaptions, is available by selecting the CC icon, also located at the bottom of the screen. And there should be ASL interpretation en route provided by Pro Bono ASL. Thank you for your patience on that. Over the course of the salon, if thoughts, questions, reactions come forth, please drop them in the chat, as they could spark new tangents, perspectives, or considerations from all in the room. Layers upon layers to establish our own undercommons. And as you connect, we request that within the space we share, that you show kindness, compassion, and respect towards our panelists and your fellow attendees. And lastly, we encourage you to watch today's program in speaker view by switching your viewing settings in the top right corner. Now about today's program. Our Studio Salon series offers an opportunity to explore the dynamic intersections between literature and contemporary art. And today's program is inspired by a current exhibition, Thomas J. Price Witness, a monumental sculpture of the everyday and the ordinary, installed in Harlem's Marcus Garvey Park through October 1st, 2022. This program aims to provide an opportunity to break down some of the big ideas and concepts of Thomas J. Price's The Distance Within into more digestible and relatable bits to a wider public, but to also provide a space for those who are already actively unpacking these ideas to commune with new and existing peers. In October, we explored self-fashion, and today we'll explore the theme of surveillance from a multitude of perspectives, hyperlocal to Harlem, US broadly, as well as from a London, UK vantage point. And to provide you a loose flow of the day, each of our panelists will offer a roughly 10-minute presentation exploring surveillance from a particular lens. Then we'll have 25 minutes of breakout groups where you can take a deeper dive with our speakers into the themes addressed using works of art as jump-offs. We'll then gather again for questions, reflections, and a final activity. And now I am so thrilled that we have 4 phenomenal speakers to explore this topic with us today. Danilo Machado is a poet, curator, and critic living on occupied land, interested in language's potential for revealing tenderness, erasure, and relationships to power. Simone Brown is Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Simone is currently writing her second book manuscript, Like the Mixture of Charcoal and Darkness, which examines the interventions made by artists whose work grapple with the surveillance of Black life, from policing, privacy, smart dust, and the FBI's COINTELPRO to encryption, electronic waste, and artificial intelligence. Together, these essays explore the productive possibilities of creative innovation when it comes to troubling surveillance and its various tactics, and imagining Black life beyond the surveillance state. Simone is the author of Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, a key inspiration for the planning of today's program. Resolve is an interdisciplinary design collective that combines architecture, engineering, technology, and art to address social challenges. They've delivered numerous projects, workshops, publications, and talks in the UK and across Europe, all of which look toward realizing just and equitable visions of change in our built environment. Much of Resolve's work aims to provide platforms for the production of new knowledge and ideas. Resolve is represented by Akil and Seth Scafe-Smith today. Full bios of everyone can be found on the event page and in the chat, and at the end of the program, we'll put in the chat a brief survey. I hope you can take a moment to complete before signing off. And I just request everybody keep their mics on mute until there are moments where we can ask you to unmute yourselves. And with that, I pass it along to our lead facilitator, Danilo, who will get us started. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much all for being here. Happy Saturday. It's been such a pleasure to collaborate with Studio and the team on this series, unpacking and drawing from this most generous, inspiring sculpture by Thomas J. Price. A few months ago, we began the series with a program around fashion, self-fashioning, joined by scholar Ricky Bird and Antoine Gregory. And thank you all if anybody here joined us for that session. And if you missed it and you're curious about that conversation, the recording is on the studio website and a link should be in the chat. And today's session is in part inspired by the fact that the figure in the sculpture is looking down at a phone, which triggered all of these questions around surveillance and around the title of the exhibition, To Witness, and who is witnessing, who is it witnessing, and how is that witnessing happening, and the overlap that can happen between witnessing, looking, surveillance, and we'll be sort of thinking through that together today. And for me, when I thought about surveillance, I thought about a work by Dred Scott called Stop, which I first saw in 2015 as part of an exhibition at Art Space New Haven, co-curated by former Studio Museum artist in residence Titus Kaffar, called Arresting Patterns. So we have some images here to start. So I remember standing right in the middle of these two video screens, faced by these figures who were expressing the number of times they had been stopped by the police. And we have a clip of it.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically
So some ads first. Do we have a clip? I can just move on to describing it as well.
No, my apologies. 1 second.
No worries.
I've got 60 or more times. I've been stopped by the cops 150 times, probably a little bit more.
I've been stopped and searched more than 100 times.
I've been stopped 60 or more times.
I've been stopped by the police 30 times or more.
I've been stopped about 20 times.
Get stopped by the cops every day, but 150s, that about sums it up. I've been stopped about 60 times or more.
I've been stopped 70 times.
I've been stopped and searched more than 100 times.
I've been stopped a lot of times,
I've been stopped by the police
150.
30 times or more.
I've been stopped
Been stopped about
70
20 times.
60 times or more.
Searched more than
I've been stopped
100
by the
times.
police 30 times or more.
I've been stopped somewhere in the
70
hundreds,
times.
close to.
I've been stopped by the police 30 times or more. I've been stopped by the police 30 times or more.
I've been stopped 70 times.
I've been stopped 150 times.
I've been stopped and searched more than 100 times.
I've been stopped about 20 times.
Thank you.
Starting an online.
So that was just a little clip from Dred Scott's Stop, which is a much longer video. And it has men from the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn, not too far from where I am here in Crown Heights today, and Liverpool, sharing their experience with being stopped by the police. And this choice by Scott to pair these two locations together is not an accident. In 1996, police from both locations met to strategize about tactics and strategies around policing. And what followed is, decades of stop and frisk, a policy well known here in New York of questioning, detaining, and searching, and which has disproportionately affected Black and Latinx men in particular. And in 2017, 90% of those stopped by police were Black or Latinx, and 70% were later found innocent. So obviously this is one sort of vantage point of surveillance, and with its limitations, but it felt particularly potent today as we're here together again between screens with co-facilitators from the US and the UK. And Stop was also part of this larger project that Scott was a part of called Postcode Criminals, which was a collaboration between Dred Scott, Joanne Kushner, and young adults from Brooklyn and Liverpool. And they have other projects sort of related as well. But this sort of two-channel video felt useful for today's theme of surveillance, as we're here between the US, between New York and the UK, as we're here between past and present, and as we're sort of thinking about both the violences of surveillance and its potential for reclamation, and this sort of duality of who is looking and who is being looked at, not to suggest a binary in any way, but simply a sort of offering a set of symmetries to keep in mind as we delve deeper into ideas of surveillance this afternoon, this morning. And so if you'd like to get a little deeper around Stop, you can join me in a breakout group later on. But for now, it's my pleasure and honor to pass it to Simone Browne.
Hi, thank you everyone at the Harlem Studio Museum of Harlem for inviting me to be in conversation with you all today. And also my appreciation goes to those of you attending virtually from places like London, Harlem, LA, Toronto, and elsewhere, or space is the place, to borrow from Sun Ra. So last week I was doom scrolling, or what I'd like to call attending late night university at TikTok, and I came across a video of some New York City cops and city parks workers dismantling, disregarding, and diminishing a community-built gym at Marcus Garvey Park. So on the next slide, you can see here some of the reporting on that. Weighted punch bags, skipping ropes, and other donated exercise equipment that took years for Jamal Ali and the people of Harlem to gather and make use of was confiscated in mere moments. Jamal Ali has been running the Lion's Den Fitness Club in the park for close to 20 years. And in the news reporting on this dismantling of the Lion's Den gym, Ali is quoted as saying, "Everybody comes out here because they feel like it's a safe haven that somewhere we can work out." In another report on the event, Jamal Ali is quoted as saying that he was specifically told that the removal of the open-air gym was part of the mayor's crackdown on encampments. So here we have Black joy in the Black outdoors, determined by the city to be unsanctioned and a public safety risk, and then swept up and like disregarded debris to be disposed of. And we can think of this as part and parcel of the ongoing campaign within the city on the surveillance of Black life. The past is prologue, as the next slide says. So rather than situating surveillance as a post 9/11 phenomena or something inaugurated with technologies such as automated facial recognition, Pegasus spyware, hidden air tags that can track people and property, Ring video doorbells, body scanners at airports, or voice-controlled digital assistants like Alexa and Siri, to see surveillance as a fact or the fact of anti-Blackness is to insist that we understand how its histories shape our present moment. And these histories include transoceanic slavery, the racial apartheid of Jim Crow, sundown towns, branding, lantern laws, as well as the inventive ways that fugitives, outlaws, abolitionists, activists, organizers, and their accomplices work to undermine the technologies of slavery and its afterlife. Of course, this is not the entire story of surveillance, but it's a part that's made normative in our current governing order. And it's from this understanding that we could come to reshape our collective futures. So from policing to incarceration, to profiling and algorithmic racism, surveillance permeates Black worlds, and it's often wielded in attempts to undermine Black resistance. Exemplary to this is the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, which ran from 1956 and 1971 and sought to disrupt, discredit, and destroy individuals, activists, artists, and political organizations that the FBI deemed subversive, like the Black Panther Party for self-defense, like Angela Davis and Malcolm X, like James Baldwin and Billie Holiday, and many, many more. COINTELPRO, of course, had its precursive formations, or that which came before it, like this Department of Justice memo that was written over a century ago, written by J. Edgar Hoover in 1919, where at the time he headed the DOJ's General Intelligence Division. This is a neutralization memo. It forms part of, I guess, the Hoover's archive on COINTELPRO and his self-loathing and anti-Black decades-long surveillance of Black organizers and activists, and in this case, Marcus Garvey's labor organizing in Panama. And you can see here, he says, or he writes, unfortunately, about Garvey, he has not yet violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the grounds of being an undesirable alien from the point of deportation. And then he goes on to think like, I'll think of something, and you can see this is the beginning of the campaign against Garvey. But there are many moments of refusal and resistance in the COINTELPRO archive, such as the memo on the next slide from the New York field office that states that Audre Lorde was interviewed in her home in 1957 at 63 East 7th Street for approximately 25 minutes. She's described here as cordial, friendly throughout the interview, and when asked to give on the matter of cooperating to the Bureau further thought, it says that she was sure she wouldn't change her mind. Now, we know that in reading these documents, we need to be mindful of their original intent, that being mainly messages back and forth from field offices to the FBI headquarters about the captioned subject. So it's of course, reading them, we have to know the intention of the documents. But often when a file is declassified, much of the original text is redacted or otherwise censored, concealed or covered up with black bars or white blocks. But as American Studies scholar Anjali Nath in her research on FOIA files tells us, quote, redaction does not negate the possibilities of interpreting and making meaning of these files, unquote. Although the redaction made on the declassified files of Audre Lorde are few, I highlight this particular memo because of the ways in which her refusal to cooperate comes through. She would not report on her friends, the FBI wrote. Cordially enough, she would not cooperate with the FBI and wondered why the FBI was interested in her in that work. In the year 2020, I'll just let someone in. In the year 2020, in the journal Synthesis, poet and novelist Norbisi M. Philip wrote Notes Towards Sealing Forensic Landscapes. And in it, she recounts when she first visited Africa and that she carried with her a metal seal embosser that she would use when she was still a practicing lawyer to emboss the seal, her own seal, on affidavits when swearing documents. She writes in these notes towards sealing forensic architecture, quote, I carried that machine with me because I wanted to prove that something had happened. My ancestor had been kidnapped and sold away from this continent I was about to visit, end quote. In this essay, Philip tells us, quote, we in America live in forensic landscapes, and that we also inhabit the scene of the crime. We are where evidence is erased and destroyed, end quote. The forensic landscapes of New York City and beyond can be witnessed in the destroyed Lion's Den gym, or if you search the hashtag NYP Omnipresence on a site like Instagram, you'll find evidence of it there. Or in the 18th century New York City laws regulating nighttime movements of enslaved Black and Indigenous people, where if after dark they were outside without a lit lantern with them or not in the presence of some white person, they could be subject to seizure and arrest. When this law was reauthorized in the late 1780s, it came not only with the requirement of supervision by some white person, but that Black people were also forbidden from carrying weapons in the city, trotting quickly on horseback, gambling, not using their indoor voices in the streets and making loud noises, or they can be apprehended by any white person that was deputized by way of white supremacy to uphold such laws. The lit candle made its holders a part of the lighting infrastructure of New York City at the time. And we can see these laws as the precursor to the ongoing stop and frisk policing practices, where categories of suspicion could be, quote, furtive movements or matches the description, or change in direction at the sight of a police officer, or inappropriate attire for the season, Toronto police carding, the, quote, known to the police, or in the case of the cop who killed Philando Castile in front of his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds and her 4-year-old daughter, just because of the wide-set nose. And we can make the links to these 18th century laws to New York City's police department's omnipresence strategy. This is the practice where flashing lights from police cruisers or floodlights are projected onto so-called hotspots and so-called high crime neighborhoods, exposing their occupants to a constant and high intensity artificial light. This outdoor lighting at night has harmful effects, such as severe glare, negative impact on sleeping and human circadian rhythmicity, the possibility of the white LED lights suppressing the production of melatonin. You could also think of the loud hum from these floodlight towers itself, from the generators itself, like a noise campaign, the nauseous smells that emanate from the exhaust. So the image on the far right is from the Instagram account of photographer Mark C. Weaver, who has an upcoming collaboration with Harlem residents who have connections to these floodlight projects. And so we'll put his contact information or his website in the chat if those of you that are want to contact and are experiencing these omnipresence effects. So on the next slide, we'll just, so the next slide is, yes, here we go. We're going to take a walk to look at Thomas J. Price's witness. So those 3 videos gave you some idea of the geography and the scope and the distance between the installation of Thomas J. Price's Witness and also the dismantling or partially dismantled Lion's Den gym. So but surveillance is the operating system of our times. Whether it's the black mirror screens on cell phones that we see, that we scroll through, that we access by way of unlock by way of facial recognition or fingerprints, or the electronic monitoring shackles that people are subjected to wear pre and post incarceration and that render their bodies satellites of the carceral state, what James Kilgore calls e-carceration, meaning the rapid proliferation of carceral tech that makes for a hybrid system of punishment that also makes for an open air prison, he says in his new book. But I want to think about the analog, digital, low-tech, grassroots, and community-centered organizing for alternative world-making, such as the group Challenging E-Carceration, or Stop Spying LAPD, or Stop Spying NYPD, or even the group on the next slide, Landlord Tech Watch, developed by a collaborative, but also one of my colleagues here at UT, Aaron McElroy, and we've put the link to this, it's in the chat that you all can check it out. But I went on it to see what was happening within the area of the park, of Marcus Garvey Park, the ways in which carceral tech, this kind of tech, landlord tech is being thank you for posting that in the chat, Megan, at stopspying.org. The way that carceral tech is being used in housing when it comes to, and the ways that this group is working towards housing equity and against housing injustice. And so I want to close with the final image, another piece by Thomas J. Price, Reaching Out, because I want to do that to gesture to the ways that Black women creatively and theoretically trouble surveillance and really let us know that surveillance is not safety. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. And Seth, will you join us now?
Hi, everyone. Hear me okay? Okay, brilliant. So I'm Seth Scafe-Smith. I am 1/6 of Resolve Collective, and as Diana so expertly put, we are an interdisciplinary design collective that works across architecture, engineering, technology, and art to address social issues. What I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of an overview of our projects and how we work as a practice, and then provide a case study of one of our projects in particular and how that relates to this topic of surveillance, and particularly a kind of an alternative way of looking at community surveillance and kind of inter-community surveillance. Next slide. So as I said, we are a practice, a collective that really focuses on working within local spaces and with local people. Next slide. Our work ranges across a number of different forms, but it often kind of supports and centers local people, and particularly young people. So we've done a lot of work with young people, and this is one of our workshops with Cornfields Youth Centre. Next slide. We've also gone into working with particularly even younger people. So this is some work that we've done with kind of 6 to 8-year-olds, but we've also had kind of relationships and projects with people of all different generations. Go to next. But our work is centered around platforming, and this picture is funny because it's quite literally platforming, but that might mean platforming communities, platforming processes, platforming kind of theories and methods of kind of positively supporting local people within their environments. Go to the next slide. So that can range from creating spaces in which other kind of creative communities and artists can collaborate within those spaces. Next one. To working more strategically in local areas and thinking about how we can kind of center this way of practicing when we're thinking about the future of these communities. Next slide. This can also range in kind of working within exhibitions and thinking about how we disrupt institutional norms and institutional forms and creating those spaces within these institutions for disruption. Go to next. And also within the public realm, so using outside space, public space as a way of celebrating and highlighting the impact that communities have had within those spaces. If we go to next. So we're fortunate enough to kind of work across different disciplines, which has meant that sometimes our work takes a digital form. I'm sure a lot of you are now a lot more familiar with kind of digital practice because of COVID, but we've managed to try and kind of figure out and navigate these digital spaces and creating these digital spaces too. Next slide. But as I said, our work, it can be very physical. So there can be a kind of physical trace or space that kind of shows the product of our work. Go to the next. It can also be digital. So there is, as I was saying, there are kind of various ways in which we've utilized and used digital design and production to share our message. And next. But importantly, it's process-led. So this means that rather than working with the aim of a product or an output, we work to value the process in which for the process that brings people together, the process that allows us to continue to learn and work collaboratively with these people in these local spaces. I know I've just been joined by my partner and colleague, Akil. Do you want to chime in or do you want me to continue going?
No, I can chime in. If you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So the presentation today, what we want to talk about is called Watching Face, Weather Surveillance in Community-Led Spatial Practice. And so for us, what's important around this topic is the acknowledgement of the use or the acknowledgement of the presence of a different type of surveillance within communities that we work in, particularly within practices like ours that seek to work within the built environment and also with communities. Next slide. The term watching face comes from an English slang term, and it's particularly apt in this case because it's also talked about in a horizontal way, not necessarily in a top-down manner or suggestive of top-down systems of intelligence and surveillance, but often of a type of peer-to-peer surveillance, this idea that someone within the community can be watching your face, you can be watching someone else's face as well. And we equate that to this idea of weather surveillance, which we describe as the periodic or continuous surveillance or analysis of a state of the atmosphere or climate. And there's something particularly astute about, I think, the idea of analyzing and surveying one's atmosphere, one's immediate climate or environment. And this is what we really liken to the types of surveillance that we see and we find when we're working in local spaces through our own practice. On the next slide, another particularly adept meaning or a title that we find comes from Stuart Marshall and Badamanti's weather surveillance radar essay, in which they talk around the surveillance mode of a weather radar equipment being the recording of automatically of all precipitation at range from a few kilometers and a few hundred kilometers that can be achieved without sacrifice of regional performance. And so this puts a local focus, a particularly local focus on this idea of recording and surveying, as being something which can enact within a much larger system, but also be achieved through local action. And so these are some of the terms that we'd like to introduce as provocations to some extent, as to how we can start to see and rethink surveillance, not just as a top-down act of observation, but also as something which occurs within intra-community links. And then on the next slide, the implications for that, particularly in our work, are this idea is about knowledge and intelligence. And as Seth described, using and working with and valuing tacit knowledge is something that a lot of our work is geared towards doing. And so whereas what we often see and where we often come across the surveillance within our lives as Black practitioners within London, a particularly surveilled place, is this idea of a top-down surveillance within the state, within where the interests of actors such as the state, private ownership, commercial interests are using inverted commas intelligence systems in order to survey a population. Where this type of weather surveillance in communities we see as a much more horizontal form of watching one another. And this transfers in a quite radical way the idea of a surveillance technology as being something which is just top down, and rather instead seeing surveillance technologies as being hanging out, as being analog ways of performing observation and watching in your own community as well. Not necessarily always a positive facet, and not necessarily always something desired, but as something which occurs and should be acknowledged. And then on the next slide, to delve into this, we've taken a project of ours called Reclaim the River, which we worked on last year, at the beginning of this year, where we hosted a community design competition in Woolwich, South East London, working with a variety of local stakeholders in order to design for into the public realm. Next slide.
So Woolwich is an area of Southeast London in which it's kind of associated with the Docklands, but it's not associated with what we kind of traditionally think of as the Docklands, in that it's south of the river. And what that's meant is that it's got this kind of quite rich and quite kind of expansive history, but that is traditionally quite unknown to the kind of the rest of the city, and in particular the rest of the country. If you go to the next slide. So like any area of the UK that's associated with the Docklands, it has this colonial kind of a relationship with the colonial past, the introduction of trade and the kind of importance of trade in the kind of trajectory of globalization, I think was really felt in a place like Woolwich, which meant that these towns rose to affluence in the kind of late 18th, 19th and 20th century and mid 20th century. Go to the next. But what we have today is, and this is kind of quite typically an area that has become extremely diverse with the kind of makeup of different ethnicities. And each of those have a kind of really strong influence and imprint on the local area, creating a kind of area of real kind of rich day-to-day experience in Woolwich. And what our project sought to do is to allow local artists or people who weren't kind of professional artists but had some kind of relationship with creativity and design to respond to different areas in Woolwich through their own design practice. So we set out a number of different briefs and then published it on a website in which people could understand what we were trying to do and how we were trying to encourage people to respond to Woolwich, and in particular Woolwich and its relationship with the river. But then they were then able to kind of craft out their own tailored response to some of these kind of inclinations that we gave them. If you go to the next.
Yeah, if you press play on the slide, sorry, that should be moving.
And then, oh, sorry. And what we did was we took on this facilitatory role. So we supported those would-be artists in the kind of the setup, the budgeting, the logistics, and if you press play on the slide. Yeah. So the setup, the budgeting, the logistics, and all of the kind of different variations of that would come into the fold, in order to allow them to explore these different local areas through their creative practice, but also kind of forge these different stories and uncover these different narratives that existed within Woolwich through the eyes of these local practitioners. And if you go to the next.
And so instances, the products of some of these processes were as follows. Here is the work of two artists, one a graffiti artist, Sujin the Groupie, and the other a 14-year-old boy called Jesse Oru. And these two artists' work was situated within an alley just off of Power Street in Woolwich. Now, the importance of this peer-to-peer surveillance that we've been talking about at the beginning was paramount in this particular instance, in that not only during the building and the kind of the life of this public artwork within the space, or within this alley, did we kind of see the importance of how people watched over that alley, but also in choosing and the selection of the bids, as Seth has described. We went through a process of creating different sites that people could bid, or people would could enter for their designs. And what showcased was that a lot of the alleyways were really prevalent in the collective imaginations of a lot of the people within Woolwich, and a lot of the would-be artists and aspiring designers within Woolwich. This idea that the alleyways are being watched, are being observed, are being surveilled, I think really shone through in some of these particular works, in that their maintenance, their repair, and also their kind of day-to-day often relied on the group surveillance of some of these less seen or perhaps even invisibilized spots within Woolwich. Next slide. This artwork was by a group, Luke Murray and Piotr Szymanowski, and this work existed behind yet another alley in Woolwich, and was working within leitmotifs of Woolwich's connection to the river, and existing materials on site. For example, the tires that appeared behind an old MOT garage. Here again, this idea of an intra-community surveillance, I think, shone through in the sense that people across the town centre and across Woolwich had a really precise and accurate idea of exactly where this location was when asked, which led to its selection as part of the brief. We really strongly relied on some of the tacit knowledges and the experiences of people in Woolwich navigating this alley and looking into this alley and experiencing this alley in order to understand what might be needed to respond to it artistically, and from whom we'd like to respond. And so part of this brief was what was really important as part of this brief was kind of understanding and mining some of those intelligences which had arisen from that local watching. Next slide. Another piece was Sarah Garrett's Women of Myrtle Alley. Sarah Gallard was responding directly to the perception of safety, particularly gendered safety, in Myrtle Alley, which is an alley which is frequented by a plethora of people in Woolwich, but also quite notably under the watch of securitized forces such as the police. And her piece chose to respond to lots of these moving parts by showcasing and celebrating the lives of women in Woolwich in these alleys. Here, surveillance and particularly this types of weather surveillance within communities, I think, shone through in the aspect that many who had seen and navigated these alleys on a day-to-day basis were drawn towards the artworks in response to their lived experiences of those alleys. The alley as an architectural space seems to be, if anything, but a deterrent. However, it was through conversations that were engaged around these artworks when they were up that we really sought to understand how important a connection and how much of a lived connection, an urban morphological connection that this alleyway is, and how it is being constantly watched and surveyed by those who use it, by those whose stories are kind of heavily entwined in it, and also by those who pass by. So these kind of tiered levels of watching and surveying these local areas. Next slide. The penultimate piece was a piece by Evie Athanasi, which was a mural on the wall inspired by some of the lives of people around Woolwich within Myrtle Alley. Again, a very similar act in this idea of surveying, but I think bringing up really interesting connotations around how spaces might also watch us, how we also might be in both existing in watch spaces, but also watched by spaces themselves. Myrtle Alley in particular, I think lends itself to this idea of a watching space, as well as having two quite distinct ends. It's also surveyed from the top by residents who can look over. Sorry, next slide. And then finally, Horace Wong's piece was installed in a pedestrian tunnel which runs underneath the Thames. So one of two of the Thames is underneath pedestrian crossings. And her piece sought to use recycled bottles from the Thames as a way of reenacting or re-performing our previously lost closeness with the river from Southeast London and Woolwich. Her piece for us highlighted a type of weathering surveillance which I think goes most unnoticed because of the transience of those who are doing the watching. When we often think of surveillance in the round, we really I think connote quite static objects. The ideas of closed circuit televisions mounted onto walls, the idea of security forces or instruments of a skewed and asymmetric or a corrupt state, watching and staking out. So these images of the stakeout of being mounted onto walls, I think, are really provoked by this idea of surveillance. But with this weathering surveillance, and particularly in here in a pedestrian path, we found the type of surveillance which is actually quite transient. The frequent yet ephemeral user of the pedestrian pathway consistently and regularly, almost kind of seasonally, coming into contact with their environment. And so for that reason, noticing very, very small changes. This was a type of surveillance as well where it's very difficult to understand where that intelligence that is derived from the observation goes towards, but one that we were really interested in trying to kind of tap into. And that's there for the pieces. And then just onto the last slide to round up. What we were interested in showcasing and perhaps evidencing in this particular talk was not necessarily the utility of peer-to-peer surveillance, but rather just the acknowledgement of it, and of it being something, a resource that is used within these community projects and community-focused projects, and should be greater acknowledged within the fields of built environment practitioners, architects, urban designers, etc., artists, etc. Moving forward, as we begin to work in more infrastructural ways in some of these communities, understanding some of the natures and the varying perceptions of peer-to-peer or weathering surveillance within communities, I think is a priority for us, and understanding how that manifests in different environments as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Akil, Seth, and Simone. Really appreciated all the ways you touched upon the different materials of surveillance, from these redacted documents to light to hum, and the the way that this operating system, as you put it, Simone, sort of expands within and beyond the material, and then it sort of evokes all of these alternative world buildings, sort of both of you talking about sort of these peer-to-peer networks, this deep hanging out, and yeah, lots of thoughts swirling, and I'm sure for y'all as well. So next we are going into 3 breakout groups. So we're going to be sort of having a very informal, casual, intimate conversation about these 3 works that sort of each of us touched upon briefly in our presentations. So I'll be leading a breakout conversation, continuing to talk about Dred Scott's Stop from 2012. Simone will be leading one around Thomas J. Price's Reaching Out. And then Resolve will be talking about a song which mentions Watching Face by Hetty One from 2019. So you'll be able to choose your breakout groups. You should see you'll be able to choose your breakout groups. You should see a bar on the bottom with a pop-up, and you can choose any of those 3 rooms. Studio team, I don't know if you have anything to add or if folks have any questions about this next section.
I think we're good to go in.
Great. Hi, welcome back, everybody. I think we're still, yeah, we'll let people trickle back in. Thanks for participating in the breakout groups. Hope you all had some good conversation, good ideas, good thinking, unpacking together around some of these artworks, some of the song, some of these texts, and some of these ideas. As people come in, we'll just have each group briefly share just some highlights from their conversation. Obviously, no pressure to recap it all, just the folks in the other that weren't as lucky to be in your group get a little taste of what y'all talked about or with each other. So I think, I'm curious. Okay, we're still waiting. Okay, I think most of us are back. Yeah. Okay. Great. So group 1, we talked about Dred Scott's Stop a little further. Malcolm, do you want to share a little bit about the conversation?
Sure. There were a few topics that we hit on. We talked about the way in which these kinds of stops can be a kind of like theater, a kind of performance, that these obviously, aren't effective ways to maintain order or prevent crime or whatever the police are supposed to be doing. But that they are often more about a kind of like communication, a kind of deterrent. We talked about the ways in which the juxtaposition of people from the US on one side and people from the UK on the other sort of mirrored real collaboration and conversation between the police forces in these two places, that the New York's police force and the UK's police force have actually worked together and talked about surveillance strategies, and how this piece was sort of doing putting the people on the receiving end of the surveillance in conversation. And in general, we talked about how these kinds of policing situations so often rely on individual discretion in a way that makes it so easy for these kinds of inequities to continue and to surface.
Thank you. Group 2, Simone's group, talking about Thomas J. Price's Reaching Out from 2020. Representative from that group want to share a little bit about their conversation?
Yeah, hey, it was really interesting. So in our group with Simone Brown, we talked a lot about June Jordan and the kind of architectural design of the skyrise of Harlem and kind of the erasure of June Jordan's actual design in that project and the vision of how surveillance isn't necessarily safety. And then Simone kind of also dived into looking at, you know, the implications of biometric surveillance. And we spoke individually in our personal experiences with these different forms of surveillance. I think someone spoke on security cameras when it came to trying to get help, I think from the hospital or the ambulance, and trying to speak to the security and the implications of like trying to get that video feed from that. A few of us just tried to, I think someone brought up how a lot of it feels a lot like mind control, right? And this idea of how surveillance is kind of warping people's understanding of themselves and their own identities. Someone spoke on trying to speak out how the implications of their data being used on the body and how that makes them feel. Yeah, it was really interesting. Also, the idea of luxury surveillance as well. Like, what does it mean when Amazon or other companies might create a commercialization of these violent technologies and put them into our own like everyday life within our homes, having like an Amazon drone that operates. Also the implications of Ringer or Siri being able to have an audio kind of muting speech into just the built space, and what does that look like? Yeah, it was really cool.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I love anytime we can evoke June Jordan. Next group 3 with Resolve, talking about the song Watch No Face by Heady One. Someone from that group going to share a little bit about your conversation.
Melania, would you mind?
No, wouldn't mind at all. Hello. First we played this song, which was really great to hear, listen to the lyrics. And we brought up just the difference between peer-to-peer surveillance and state or top-down surveillance, about how peer-to-peer surveillance was about noticing the consistencies in the community, and top-down surveillance was or is about looking out for inconsistencies and looking out for things that don't seem right. One of the participants in the group, Fashion Edict, I think, was also talking about how alleyways and abandoned spaces can become bridges in the community, depending on how well the community knows these spaces and how they use them. We also mentioned a book called Harlem is Nowhere, which I can drop in the chat. What else? About how observation can become a currency and how that changes when gentrification occurs. so like what you're watching will change, and like who you're watching will change depending on who you're around, if they're people you know, or if they're people who are just arriving, and how to build trust when working with institutions or with local entities. Yeah, it's a great combo.
Thank you. I love this idea of like alleyways as bridges, and sort of that reclamation of that space, and obviously related to the artwork you showed resolved in the alleyway, and that sort of a universally sometimes charged or like potent sort of space, in between space, as many of these are. Great. So now we have time for questions and some discussion before we have a final wrap-up activity. So do folks have any questions for our panelists, or for each other? Any, other nuggets from your breakouts? Yeah, thank you, Simone, for these links in the chat too, Melania. That's a good question. Do you have any thoughts about other universally charged spaces, or spaces that can be sort of charged, or I don't know, sort of hold some weight in a community?
I don't know. I think that just, when you said that, it just like sparked something, but I was wondering what you were thinking of when you put that together with alleyways.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of brought me back to the Project Resolve shared. I don't know if Akil might want to sort of share a little bit about that project, or Melania, from your discussion in the breakout group, sort of what the conversation was like in terms of the alleyway.
I think that some really interesting discussion was raised around like the resolution at which we're kind of observing and surveying these spaces. Sorry, apologies as well if my signal kind of goes off. It's been having a lot of technical difficulties. But the notion of universally charged spaces, I think, is really it's just really apparent. And I think in our line of work, we often come across universally charged spaces, but perhaps like universally depreciated spaces as well. So this interesting paradox, and those become the points at which this type of peer, like this weathering surveillance, I think really starts to matter the most. And these ones which seem to have no ostensible value, be that financial value, be that kind of environmental or any other types of social value, political value, but actually are often instrumentalized, or in a less more innocuous sense, are the preoccupation of passers-by, of residents, of people who are of shoppers, sorry. So and alleyways, I think, are a very beautiful example of that, but underpasses are another. So often where you built underneath roads, those are hugely charged universal spaces in our line of work, I'd say. Toilets, public toilets are massively universally charged spaces, and especially in the UK, we're within there the huge war on the social welfare state, on the provisions of the state, be that within the public realm, so things like public toilets, or on benefits for housing. All of those things are being quite violently reduced, and we're seeing explosions in some of the more obvious, but also some of the more subtle consequences of those things as well. Public toilets fits within those dynamics as something which is very which is never talked about at national discourses. There is no national discourse around public toilets. There's no regional discourse around public toilets. But there's a very highly charged local discourse around public toilets, and even more so within like within conversations, everyday conversations. There are lots of emotive topics around these types of resources. And so this universally charged spaces, I think, for me also comes with, I think it has to necessarily come with an ostensible sense of disuse. You know, a universally charged space probably isn't something like, you know, a monument. For me, I think there's something quite different in that. But they straddle the monumental, but I wouldn't describe them necessarily as monuments, and that I think comes into the works at question today as well, with it, the particularly how Thomas J. Price's statues kind of straddle this idea of the monumental, but actually I think they, in a very meaningful way, also straddle the idea of a social system. They cross that boundary, I think, in quite interesting ways.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, lots of ideas there. Do folks have any reactions or things to add to that?
I think just adding to that, what we mentioned about like Fred Wilson and Garden View, and how that's also in contention with being in artistic spaces, but there still being that air of you can come in, but you may not necessarily belong here, or you don't deserve to be in the spaces that you are observing, whether it be you're participating in educational programs or public programming as this. There's certain elements that can tie into that in regards to surveillance, depending on security, certain signages, if that's accessible to people who may have other disabilities, and how that can also interact with, once you step outside of the space, is it accessible to the larger focus?
Yeah, and with all these pictures, I'm like thinking about like closed spaces, maybe like the alleyway, like a train car, and open spaces like a park, and the sort of the differences in the way that surveillance plays a role in them.
And I think I'm just thinking back to what was mentioned earlier about surveillance as often being a scan for like either inconsistencies or inconsistencies with an expectation, and that, like, you know, in spaces like museums, but in many spaces, there are specific ways that different groups of people based on race and gender and age and are supposed to act. And if you're acting as, like, you know, you might be acting in a way that is acceptable in the space, and you might be a person who would be acceptable in the space, but if you're not playing the role that a person like you is expected to play, that can be an inconsistency that is being surveilled for. So yeah, like the Black man in the museum who is not the security guard.
Any final thoughts or questions? And we'll move into one last collective activity to close out. Okay, so Melanie, if you can pull up the slide. If you'll indulge me in some collective poetry. So in 1961, the death and life of great American cities, Jane Jacobs writes that for a city or a street to be safe, quote, there must be eyes upon the street, eyes belonging to those we might call the natural proprietors of the street. And in 2013, Justice for Families expands upon this idea in this poster created further Night Out for Safety, which in itself is a counter to the National Night Out campaign, which sort of encouraged neighborhoods or neighbors to be an extension of the police, and the Justice for Families sort of was pushing back against that with this campaign, sort of imagining a more expansive sort of eyes on the street, peer-to-peer sort of community alternative to surveillance. So today we'll be writing an expansion of this poster as a poem in the chat. So if you're up for it, if you could add your own line filling in the phrase "I see them." So the poster says, "I don't watch my neighbors, I see them, we make our community safer together." So what might go in that place of the word see? So what might fill in that blank? So it could be, for me, I don't watch my neighbors, I care for them, we make our community safer together. So if you want to share in the chat what your phrase would be in terms of your neighbors and your community safety together, we can sort of close with this moment of care and of optimism in terms of, the kinds of surveillance that that counter the violences, or at the very least are pushing back against them. Yeah, I don't watch my neighbors, and Myra says, I say hello to them. We make our community save them. I eat with them. I deeply love them. I create with them. I feed them. I help them. I share with them. I hug them. I laugh with them. I affirm their presence in the space we inhabit. I smile with them. I dance with them. I dance with them again. I gossip with them, yes. I watch their cats when they're on holiday. I ask them to imagine with me. I garden with them. I go out to eat with them. Wow, these are so amazing. I believe in them. I walk with them. Wow, we make our community safer together. Indeed, what a beautiful poem, and what a filling program this Saturday. Thank you all again so much for being here. Thank you, Simone, Akil, and Seth, for co-imagining together for this program. And I'll turn it over to studio for some closing.
Thanks, Danilo. And I just want to thank everyone for sharing time and space with us today on a Saturday, regardless of the time zone that you might be occupying. But every program that we do is a labor of love, and this is no exception. And it's hard sometimes to have conversations around topics that oftentimes can be censored or considered hypersensitive, but I am grateful for us to be able to have these spaces to ideate and build and to think about different possibilities or ways of of navigating and creating communities in the way that we want and know they should and can be. So I just want to thank immensely to Danilo and Simone and Akil and Seth for building this with us today, and all of you for joining us. And we will be sharing out additional links, so the resources that were shared throughout this program, either via email or on the event page, which will also add the recording of this program. So if you want to spread the word to those who weren't able to make it, they can see it there. And just another plug, if you're craving some more studio public program time, we have another digital program taking place on Tuesday, April 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time in support of our exhibition Projects Khalil Robert Irving, which is at MoMA until May 1st. And it's, and actually, if you are in New York or can make your way to New York, that exhibition is free. And the program that we have on Tuesday is in collaboration with our MoMA colleagues, and it will be Khalil in conversation with the scholar Andre Brock and the poet Simone White. It is not to be missed. More information can be found on our website. And with that, I say thank you, take care, and stay well.